Imagine this. You are desperately trying to make your friends, family, neighbors, your husband believe that you are you and not an imposter. You say your name over and over again, but they don't believe you. They don't believe that you are you. I'm Heidi from the Obsession podcast, and today I'll be telling one of the darkest stories you will probably hear on this show. It's a story of Bridget Cleary, and just a warning, it contains marital abuse, coercive control, and violent death. But as always, I will be illustrating the story, as I'm always inspired to do. And if you feel inspired by this story, maybe you can draw along with me. Bridget Cleary was born Bridget Boland in 1869 in the rural town of Ballivadley in County Tipperary, Ireland. Her father, Patrick Boland, was a labourer, and Bridget and her siblings were some of the few children in the area who were literate. Patrick was determined that his children would get an education and lift themselves out of the poverty that surrounded them. Well, Bridget had inherited his determination, and after a childhood attending the local school, she moved to the nearby town of Clonmel and became a dressmaker's apprentice. Bridget, as we will see, was the girl who had everything. She was smart, confident, had an amazing work ethic and a vivacious personality. On top of that, she was very pretty and had no shortage of marriage proposals. But the one man who had truly captivated her interest, however, was a cooper called Michael Cleary. She was 18 and he was 27, and apart from the age difference, they were considered pretty well suited. Michael was considered to be a lovely fellow, handsome with impeccable manners. They married in 1887, the same year that they met. Now, this is where we first see how unconventional Bridget must have been for a woman of her time. Instead of remaining in Clonmel with her husband, the newly married Bridget moved back to Ballivadley to live with her parents. Michael stayed in Clonmel during the working week and spent the weekends with his wife in the Boland household. You can imagine what the neighbours would have thought of this arrangement. Almost as shocking was what Bridget brought back home with her: a Singer sewing machine. Now, this seems like a small detail, but it was a big deal for a person to have their own Singer. They were very expensive and had to be paid off in installments. Bridget had the audacity to set herself up as an independent dressmaker and businesswoman. As well as that, she bought chickens and started a side business, delivering freshly laid eggs to the local homesteads. She dressed in the most fashionable clothes and seemed to cherish the independence that she had during the week when her husband was out of town. Well, of course, the neighbours had opinions. They sure did. The gossips of Ballivadley had a great time discussing the love affairs they thought that Bridget and even Michael must be having. As an attractive and ambitious woman, Bridget was looked upon with suspicion and probably some resentment. Also, The Clearys were childless, even after some years of marriage. Irish families in those days were very large, and couples that struggled with infertility were seen as very sad. Bridget, however, didn't seem to mind her childless state. The time she would have spent on rearing children was given wholeheartedly to her business ventures, and Bridget seemed content with her life. She was thriving financially and becoming a highly respected dressmaker. She took care of her elderly parents and seemed to be happy enough with Michael when they were together. At some point, her father, Patrick, decided to take advantage of a government housing scheme that upgraded the dwellings of retired labourers. Patrick accepted the offer of a beautiful new cottage so that his daughter and son-in-law could stay there, giving the couple an opportunity to live together alone for the first time in their marriage. It seems to be the perfect situation, right? Well, not quite. The reason why they were able to obtain the nicest cottage in town was because nobody else wanted it. The house had been built on a ring fort. So, I'm going to just pause the story here to give a bit of folkloric backstory. So, ring forts are the remains of ancient houses, some of them dating back to the Iron Age. These houses were round, which means that their remains are often in the form of large circles in the earth, while some even have remnants of stone walls. Oh, what's the big deal, you might ask? A bit of archaeological history in your backyard? Seems kind of cool, right? Well, the thing is that rural Ireland of that time was a place deeply connected to mysticism, magic, and superstition. In fact, the ring forts were often known as fairy forts. Now, when I talk about fairies in this story, I'm not talking about Tinkerbell. I'm not talking about Disney. I'm not talking about the lovely fairy illustration behind me. No. The fairy lore of old Ireland is both rich and terrifying. Fairies will curdle your milk, cause you to lose your way, injure you, kidnap you, and if you anger them enough, they will kill you. They were often called the good people, not because they were actually good, but as a method of appeasement and flattery. Ring forts, or fairy forts, were believed to be jealously guarded by the fairies, and there are even stories of the rings being portals into the world of fairy, a place you do not want to go to as much as you think you do. Living on or close to a fairy fort was seen as incredibly bad luck, and when Bridget's mother passed away soon after the move, the locals blamed the family's foolhardy decision to disturb such a magical area. Bridget, however, appeared to have a great interest in the fairies, and unlike most of the locals, she wasn't frightened of going into the most fairy-inhabited places. Now, you might remember that as well as being a dressmaker, Bridget had a side hustle as a poultry farmer. And on Monday, March the 4th, 1895, Bridget was on her usual egg delivery route. One of her customers was Jack Dunn, who also happened to be her father's cousin and a noted expert in fairy lore. Jack lived near a fairy fort with a particularly dangerous reputation. Well, Bridget, being brave, did what she always did. She lingered near the edges, and her keen and curious eyes watched for any movement that she could attribute to the good folk. She may have even left an offering of some sort for luck. Jack wasn't at home, and despite the cold, Bridget waited for him. After a while, the chill became too much for her, and Bridget set off home. Even sitting by the fire in her cottage, Bridget couldn't get warm. She went to bed with a terrible migraine and was too ill to get up the next morning. It was so out of character for Bridget to take a day off work that Patrick, her father, took a 4-mile trek in a rainstorm to find the nearest doctor. The doctor was booked out for most of the week, but he assured Patrick that it sounded as though Bridget had nervous excitement and slight bronchitis. Michael, however, didn't accept this diagnosis. He made his own visit to the doctor, only the symptoms he listed were quite different. He claimed that Bridget was now 2 inches taller than she had been before falling ill. He also described her as being too fine to be the real Bridget, meaning perhaps that her appearance was more beautiful than she was normally. I don't really know what he meant by that. He spoke to Jack Dunn, who, as we know, was a respected expert on the fairy realm, and he came away with the idea that the figure lying in their bed was not his wife Bridget, but a changeling. So, what is a changeling? Well, as we said before, rural Ireland of old had an adamant belief in fairies. Anything that couldn't be explained was blamed on vengeful fairies, and this included health problems, birth conditions, and mental illness. A fairy might steal a perfectly healthy human baby and leave one of their own babies, or even an elderly fairy in its place, which would be sickly and fail to thrive. In a time when many health conditions had no name, it was easier to believe that a child with a sickness or a disability was a fairy replacement for their own child, otherwise known as a changeling. Parents who believed their child to be a changeling usually did one of 3 things. Well, they took responsibility for the child and accepted it into the family. They abandoned the child, or they subjected the child to a series of abusive rituals intended to drive the fairy out and bring the original child back. The third option often ended in the child's death. Adult changelings were less common, but they were used to explain sudden personality changes that these days we might attribute to mental health issues. Whether people truly believed that their loved ones had been stolen by the fairies, or whether they were putting a psychological distance between themselves and the abandonment or killing of the loved one, is up for debate, and something that we do discuss in the podcast, which you can find on Spotify and Apple Podcast if you want to listen to this story in more depth. Well, the doctor did visit, and as he suspected, Bridget had bronchitis. Some sources say that the doctor wasn't terribly concerned and recommended a few days of bed rest. Some say that he told them to summon the priest to administer the last rites. Well, either way, the priest did arrive to do just that, and it triggered panic in the household. It wasn't just the priest who stirred up fear. Our good friend Jack Dunn advised Michael and Patrick to summon Dennis Gainey, the local fairy doctor. And yes, that was a job back then. People who were fairy experts could be called fairy doctors. So Michael did visit this Gainey person, who made a herbal concoction that Bridget was to drink with boiled milk. The cottage was full of relatives and neighbours when Bridget was made to take Gainey's herbal remedy. 3 male cousins pinned Bridget to the bed while her husband held her mouth open and forced the drink down her throat. Also present was her father, Patrick, an aunt called Mary Kennedy, cousin Joanna Burke, Jack Dunn, and a local couple, William and Minnie Simpson. Michael yelled out questions such as, "Are you Bridget Cleary or Bridget Boland, wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of God?" And the male cousins apparently threw urine at her. There's not much detail about how this was done or why, but I'm guessing it was part of the fairy banishing law, and I wouldn't be surprised if Gainey or Dunn had put them up to it. Then the men hoisted up the screaming and terrified Bridget, took her over to the fireplace, and continued their questions while she was held over the grate. Over and over again, "Are you Bridget Boland, daughter of Pat Boland, wife of Michael Cleary?" While Bridget screamed that yes, she was. Eventually, Bridget was put back in bed, and the onlookers went home. Thankfully, Michael seemed happy with what he saw, and he left her in peace for the night. Aunt Mary and cousin Joanna helped her change her nightdress and cleaned her up before tucking her in. The next day was March the 15th, and Bridget finally felt strong enough to get out of bed. She did something that her cousin Joanna saw as life-affirming. She put on one of her fashionable outfits and her gold earrings. A priest had already been over to cleanse the room with a blessing, and that evening they had guests over for tea. Now, most of what happens next was reported by Joanna Burke, and this next part is taken from her own court testimony. Her father, my brother, and myself, and deceased and her husband, sat by the fire. They were talking about fairies, and Mrs. Cleary said to her husband, "Your mother used to go with the fairies, and that's why you think I am going with them." He asked her, "Did my mother tell you that?" She said, "She did, that she gave 2 nights with them." I made tea and offered Bridget Cleary a cup of it. Her husband got 3 bits of bread and jam and said she should eat them before she should take a sup. He asked her 3 times, "Are you Bridget Cleary, my wife, in the name of God?" She answered twice and ate 2 pieces of bread and jam. When she did not answer the 3rd time, he forced her to eat the 3rd bit, saying, "If you won't take it down, you will go." He flung her on the ground, put his knee on her chest, one hand on her throat, and forced the bit of bread and jam down her throat, saying, "Swallow it. Is it down? Is it down?" Joanna goes on to state in her testimony that she told Michael to leave Bridget alone, and that the person in front of them was Bridget, not a fairy. It was then that Michael stripped Bridget down to her calico underdress, took a burning stick from the fire, and held it close to her mouth. At some point during this ordeal, Joanna claims to have heard Bridget's head slam against the floor. And this is when Michael exclaims that she is dead. And I truly hope she was dead at that point. Aunt Mary, who was in the back room while this was happening, claims that by the time she ran to the kitchen, Bridget's underclothes had already caught fire. Now, remember that Bridget's father and other cousins are also present, and they've been yelling out at Michael to stop what he's doing. Michael doesn't stop. He takes a lamp and pours paraffin over Bridget's body, causing her to burst into flames. When a cousin, James Kennedy, later testified in court, he said that Michael turned around to say, "She's not my wife. She's an old deceiver sent in the place of my wife. She's after deceiving me for the last 7 or 8 days, and deceived the priest too, but she won't deceive anyone anymore. As I beginned it with her, I will finish it with her. You'll soon see her go up the chimney." The terrified guests hid both from Michael and the flames in the back bedroom. After he'd taken care of the fire, Michael opened the door and ordered one of Bridget's cousins, Patrick Kennedy, to assist him in getting rid of the body. Everyone else was locked in until their return. The family was sworn to silence, and Michael spent days at the fairy ring near Jack Dunn's house, claiming that he believed the real Bridget would return on a white horse. Meanwhile, the Royal Irish Constables were searching the countryside for a woman who had been reported missing. It was on the 22nd of March that they finally found the shallow, boggy grave that had been dug by Michael and Patrick. Bridget was wrapped in a sheet, and her body was the most terribly mutilated that they had ever seen. Her lower body was so badly burned that parts of her skeleton could be seen, and a stocking and one gold earring was all that remained of her clothing. No funeral was held for Bridget. She was buried 5 days after being found, with no ceremony or wake. Now, one of the chief troublemakers in this story, Jack Dunn, had also happened to be the reason why her body was ever uncovered by police. Michael had told him of the burning of his wife, and a horrified Jack told the priest, who then made a police report. The newspapers went wild, and the story even spread as far as the New York Times. In Britain, the conservative Tory reportage took on a political edge. How, they asked, could they grant autonomy to a people so savage as to believe in fairies and use them as a motive for murder? Court proceedings began on the 3rd of July, and there were 9 defendants indicted on charges of wounding. The 5 that were also indicted for murder were Michael Cleary, Patrick Boland, Mary Kennedy, James Kennedy, and Patrick Kennedy. The jury were made to view Bridget's body, both to identify her and to be made aware of the extent of the violence that had caused her death. Most of the defendants were given months to several years of penal servitude. Michael Cleary was sentenced to 20 years of penal servitude for manslaughter, of which he ended up serving 15. The only thing known about Michael's life after prison was that he lived for some time in Liverpool before emigrating to Montreal in 1910. The tragic death of Bridget Cleary is retold over and over again through children's rhymes, songs, plays, and poetry. The oral history of Tipperary has added a richness of detail, as well as opinions and theories. The reports are all varied, all conflicting, and whether or not Michael truly believed his wife was a changeling is still up for debate. What isn't up for debate is the vile villainy of Michael and the tragedy of Bridget's death. Well, My drawing is going to be of Bridget in happier times. If you have any drawings inspired by this story, please send them to us. I hope you, well, it's probably not right to say enjoyed this story, but, well, I hope you found it compelling. Well, that's enough for today, and I'll see you later on. Please subscribe to the channel. We are a new channel. Follow, click subscribe, and check out the podcast. And see you later. Stay well and stay obsessed with weird things. Bye.